Oh, good morning, ComBappers, lurkers, everybody else. This is Alice. Say hi to Alice. And Alice,
Hi,
say hi back.
everybody. You all know me.
Good to see you, Alice. Alice is calling in from way on the other side of Swift Current. That's right. We've been using ComBap Update to connect with our church folks, both past and present, anybody that sort of has a relationship to us, everything from the executive minister to good old Louise and Moose Jaw, and of course some people here in town that have gone through different experiences and are willing to share. So we had Pat, who is in the middle of finishing up her cancer treatments, and today we have Alice, who she dealt with cancer treatments a few years back, and also her husband dealt with some brain tumor issues. But let's start. That's the teaser. We'll get to that in a bit.
Okay.
We'll get to this. We'll get to your scripture of the morning first, and let you chat about that, and then we'll carry on afterwards.
Okay, Isaiah 57:15.
Are you going to read it for us, or am I going to read it?
I can read it.
Atta-girl.
This is what the high and exalted one says. He who lives forever, whose name is holy. I live in a high and holy place, but also with the one who is contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the heart of the contrite. I don't know. I've just always really liked the imagery in that verse. And I was probably in my late 20s when I heard somebody preach on Isaiah, and I suddenly thought, you know what? Maybe it's time I get into the Old Testament and stop just doing New Testament stuff. And that's a verse that I've always liked. And now lately, every once in a while, when I sort of feel like my praying needs a little bit of a boost, I'll start to just conscientiously isn't really the right word, but to focus on the Lord, on the pattern of the Lord's Prayer. And it just all of a sudden hit me. Wow, the first verses of the Lord's Prayer sort of echo this. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed or holy is your name. I mean, we're addressing him as Father, and yet he is this high, holy being. So,
well, I never noticed that before. So good. Thanks for teaching me something this morning. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and when you think about, saying highly exalted one, and also known as Dad, right? It's a big contrast.
Exactly.
Great stuff. Okay, good. Well, hey, I've been here 15 years in Swift Current, and when I first moved here in Swift Current, you and Arnold were dealing with him having multiple surgeries. When did that all start with Arnold?
It started in 87. He was 37 years old.
87. Wow. That's the year we got married. Okay. My wife and
I. Yeah. Cheryl was in kindergarten, and Carmen would have been in grade 3. And then, of course, in retrospect, we realized that we'd actually been dealing with this for at least a couple of years prior to that, right, with struggling with coping mechanisms and that sort of thing, because it was brain surgery. He had, although they called it head surgery at that time, which is quite ironic.
Really? Okay.
I still find myself sometimes referring to his surgeries as head surgery.
Well, it was in his head, so.
The reason for doing that, though, was because they didn't want people to freak out. It was like any other surgery. I mean, I remember a nurse saying to him when he asked about risks, and well, there's always risk when you have anesthetic. But of course, over the years, they've learned that when you mess with the brain, it's not visible to the human eye so much, not like a broken leg where you've got a cast on it or something. And yet there's healing times. So he actually went back to work 6 weeks after his surgery, which now would be unheard of.
So then what was the growth? Was it a cyst or was it a tumor? What was it?
It started out as a cyst.
Okay.
And they put in a short shunt just draining into, just down into the neck barely.
So we hear a lot about shunts. So really, are they just draining tubes? Is that the best way to put it, or what are they exactly?
Yep. They just to try to keep the pressure equalized, and so they They drain the fluid off into another part of the body where it can be absorbed and
Right.
isn't going to cause any problem.
Right.
So then after about, well, he always had some struggles, and of course we're talking about times when all we had was CT scans, right?
Mm-hmm.
And no MRIs yet. I mean, CT scans were wonderful, but they were learning to save lives, but they weren't really learning how to teach people to live with problems that resulted. And of course, because it was only CT scans, they weren't near as precise as they are now about getting in at the area.
Right.
So, but, and this is sort of an interesting thing. When he was in the hospital that time, my mom was there with me, and she was talking about, waiting for the pathology report. And Arnold didn't hear this, but I said, well, don't say that to Arnold. He thinks because it's a cyst, there's no chance of it being cancer. Mm-hmm. So till he needs to think differently, we won't worry him with it. And so it never was cancer. It was just, it's an epidermoid situation, which is a slow growing thing. It's when the fetus was formed.
Epidermoid?
Yep.
That sounds like, isn't that mean skin? Dermis?
Yep. And what happens is that as the fetus is forming, certain skin cells are not sloughed off when they're supposed to be.
Oh, okay.
And so they often go undetected for years and years. And so I'm sure people have them and they never bother you, but yeah, late 30s is a typical time for some problems too.
So you're telling me that humans slough their skin like snakes do? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
I have no idea exactly, but that's how it's described. I mean,
well, it could be, right? It could very well be.
We are fearfully and wonderfully made.
Right.
So eventually, he started to have more symptoms, and they would do CT scans, and by then they had MRIs, and I would beg for an MRI, and they said, no, we don't need to do the MRI because we can see that the shunt is working. It should all be good, and go and live your life kind of a thing. But eventually it got to the point where they had to do an MRI because there were just too many little things. Like he's had tinnitus for years, ringing in the ears. Then he started to, what really freaked him out was he was always very meticulous. He was always a really good driver, and he worked as a mechanic. And he missed the hoist.
Oh.
Fortunately didn't cause damage to the vehicle, but it freaked him out because that was unheard of for him. So then we started paying attention, and we realized that he wasn't seeing to the left.
Oh my.
He had blind areas there. So we went to the optometrist and said, there's something wrong with his left eye. And the optometrist did a test, and he said, no, you got to go to an ophthalmologist. It's not your eye. So then that's when we got the MRI.
So what year would this be?
That would have been in 99.
Oh, okay.
I think. Yeah. So he had gone 12 years, but I mean, they weren't all good years.
Right.
And so at that time, the cyst had become, they called it like a cheesy tumor.
Oh my.
Which was and the cheesy part is to describe the makeup of it. It was a soft.
Yeah.
Soft.
It's gross.
Substance.
It's gross and but yet thick. Yeah. It's like, yeah. Should we get really graphic? It's pussy that it's thick pussy. That's
that sort of thing. So that was during the time when we were in the little old church on Winnie Street. And Pastor Rick would muster every time I would phone. And it was amazing. Every time I phoned the church, there was somebody there to answer the phone, because this turned out to be kind of a big deal. He ended up with 3 surgeries in very quick succession. He had a surgery, and that was an interesting surgery too, because that came later. They took out as much of the tumor as they were able to. They were afraid to take too much because, when you mess in the brain.
Yep, for sure.
You can injure what you don't want. And his incision healed, but he kept oozing CSF fluid, cerebral spinal fluid. And so everybody was praying about this, and we thought he was healed. It stopped. And so he was sent home. But then about 4 or 5 days later, he had a discharge, and we realized it was. So then we went back, and it was. And before they could get him into surgery, because they had opted not. They didn't think they needed a shunt at that time. That was the thing, because the whole structure of the thing had changed. Right. So we went back, and he got really quite sick with fever and so on before they were able to get him into surgery. So they were afraid that there might be infection, so they didn't want to put a permanent shunt in.
Oh, okay.
So they put an external drain in, and it was basically like siphoning gas. No kidding. That's how the doctor explained it to me. They had a ruler by his bedside, and they adjusted the level of the bed. And then if at mealtime, they would clamp off the tube so that he could sit up and eat, and then they would readjust the thing down again. And so then when his fever subsided and they felt it was safe, then they went back in and put in another shunt, because what had happened was that now where they had removed the tumorous material, there was a cavity.
Oh, that's right.
And so fluid was collecting there. So then he got the other shunt, the VP shunt, which goes around the back, or you have the incision on the back of the head, and then you got a tube that comes around and drains into your chest cavity.
That's amazing.
I think our friend Janita has one of those too, probably. They're called VPs.
Wow. So, I mean, it's a serious plumbing going on. My goodness. Wow. And then, so this takes us up to, because when we arrived in 2005, he was still.
Okay. And then he was still doctoring. So then, in 2006, so the VP shunt was taking fluid off, just the general, the whole general area of the brain.
Okay.
And so then, in 2006, he was starting to have quite a lot of problems.
Right.
He was having trouble walking. He was starting to stumble quite a bit. And so MRIs were getting a little better. So then they decided they needed a second shunt to take the pressure out of that cavity.
Right.
So that was quite a journey. So the doctor made a decision. He put in a device which he could access with a needle and drain off the fluid. And that worked for a while. We would go every 3 or 4 months, and they would stick in the needle, drain off
I remember that.
But then that didn't work for very long. So then he had to take it, and
they had cut some of his skull away too, right?
Oh, he's had all of his issues are to the left.
Okay.
But the brain reverses a lot of stuff.
Right.
So his incision is actually on the right side, and it's just above the ear. And he has started just shaving his head, because he said, over time that has indented quite a bit. They call it a divot, I guess. And he said, barbers don't know what to do with it, so he just goes down in the basement and shaves his own head. And
I got a few of those divots, but that's just from hitting my head on things.
Yeah, and he doesn't need haircuts that often.
That's right. He's got a good hairdo, like mine.
So then they took out that was called an Omaya reservoir. If anyone cares to look at it. Yeah. And it actually, what those are, the doctor was using it in reverse, because those are often used to target chemotherapy into the brain. Yep. So the doctor was using it in reverse by withdrawing stuff. Anyway, so then they put in just a regular shunt that drains back down just into the neck area. So he has 2 shunts.
So that was so from, you said from 87 And his last surgery then would have been when? Because he hasn't had any for
So
quite a
then he
while.
had one in 90, what did I say, 07?
Yeah.
And then they did the reversal in 09. So that's the last surgery
Yeah.
he's had.
So 11
And
years surgery free.
so he's been reasonably stable, but of course, after all that time, there's he struggles.
He ain't getting younger either, right? So
exactly. And then the aging thing comes up. And so we actually just talked with the doctor today, and I think we're probably looking at hip replacement down the road because he's been having a lot of arthritic pain.
Okay.
And so,
well, hopefully all those surgeries will get back online pretty quick.
And then I always said, well, it's a good thing one of us is healthy.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna stop it, and we're gonna do a part 2 tomorrow. Okay. So
okay.
We're gonna do part 2 tomorrow, which means you have to come up with another Bible verse. So.
Okay.
Because we're gonna have to do. So we're just gonna continue this conversation tomorrow, and I'm just gonna record it, and we'll do it right away. But it won't be out till tomorrow. So because that's the Arnold story, and now we got to get to the Alice story.
Oh, okay.
All right. So we'll be back in 2 seconds, but everybody else will be back tomorrow.